November 12, 1944, Fort Stockton, Texas. The transport truck shuddered to a stop outside the barbed wire fence, desert dust settling like ash in the afternoon heat. 23 Japanese women sat in rigid silence inside the canvas-covered bed. Their khaki auxiliary uniforms stained from 3 weeks of ocean crossings and rail journeys. Each woman wore a mask of controlled terror beneath the Texas sun. Through the gap in the canvas, they could see American soldiers waiting. The enemy, the devils they had been warned about since the day they enlisted. Before we continue with this remarkable story of humanity emerging from hatred, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold World War II histories that challenge everything you thought you knew. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from: Tokyo, London, New York, anywhere at all. These forgotten moments of compassion deserve to be remembered, and your engagement helps us keep bringing them to light. 24-year-old Yuki Tanaka clutched a silk pouch containing her family photograph as the truck's engine ticked and cooled. Her hands trembled despite years of military discipline. She had served the Imperial Japanese Women's Auxiliary Corps as a communications operator in the Philippines before American forces overran her position. Now she faced something her superiors had promised would never happen: surrender. Captivity. Life at the mercy of an enemy she had been taught to fear more than death itself. The propaganda films had been explicit. American soldiers were barbaric monsters who tortured prisoners for sport, who showed no mercy, who violated the most basic codes of human decency. The truck's tailgate dropped with a metallic clang that made several women flinch. Yuki wondered if she would survive long enough to see Japan again. And in that moment, as she climbed down from the truck and saw the neat barracks buildings and American guards standing at attention rather than charging forward with bayonets, she realized everything she had been told about America might be a carefully constructed lie. The Japanese Women's Auxiliary Corps had been established in 1943 as Japan's empire began to crumble under the weight of Allied advances across the Pacific. By late 1944, approximately 45,000 women served in various auxiliary roles: communications operators like Yuki, nurses, administrative clerks, logistics coordinators. They wore military uniforms and followed military discipline, but they were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were support personnel thrust into combat zones as Japan's manpower reserves evaporated like morning mist under the scorching sun of total war. When Manila fell to American forces in early 1944, hundreds of these auxiliary women found themselves cut off from retreat, isolated in collapsing defensive positions. Unlike their male counterparts who had been indoctrinated with the warrior code of Bushido's the belief that death was preferable to the shame of surrender, these women faced capture with no cultural framework for understanding it. Japanese military propaganda had filled their minds with nightmares. Surrender meant rape and murder. Americans were devils incarnate who delighted in prisoner suffering. Death by suicide grenade was presented as the only honorable option. Yet here they stood in a Texas prison camp, watching American soldiers who did not strike them or scream orders, who instead maintained a professional distance, almost courteous in their measured movements. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, like trying to reconcile two contradictory truths that could not possibly exist simultaneously. Captain James Whitmore commanded Fort Stockton's POW facility, which primarily housed German and Italian prisoners captured in North Africa and Europe. The arrival of Japanese women represented an unprecedented challenge because he doubted his ability to maintain security, but because he understood the depth of their terror. Intelligence reports had documented Japanese beliefs about American brutality. These women expected hell. Whitmore was determined to give them humanity instead, not out of weakness, but because the 1929 Geneva Convention mandated it, and because he believed America's strength lay not just in military might, but in moral authority. The 23 women formed two ragged lines, standing at attention despite exhaustion and fear. Interpreter George Takahashi, a Japanese American from the Miss, addressed them in accented but clear Japanese. They were prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention and would receive food, shelter, medical care, and dignity. No harm would come to them. Yuki exchanged a disbelieving glance with Kiko Yamamoto, a young nurse captured with her. Adequate food sounded impossible. For months, they had survived on thin rice gruel as Japan's supply lines collapsed in late 1944. Rations meant for combat troops had dwindled to starvation levels. Thousands were dying, not from bullets, but disease and hunger. Promises of care felt like another trick. As guards led them to their barracks, a rich, unfamiliar smell drifted from a nearby building, awakening a sharp, desperate hunger. It suggested abundance Yuki had never known. The barracks, smelling of fresh pine and desert heat, were simple but clean cots, blankets, footlockers. Sunlight through open windows. Nothing resembled the torture chambers she'd imagined. Corporal Rosa Martinez explained the routine wake at 0600. Meals, work, lights out. Professional.com. The women whispered that night, unsure whether to expect kindness, starvation, or something in between. Yuki no longer knew what to believe. Across the barracks, 26-year-old Michiko Sato sat alone, back straight despite her exhaustion. She had served as an administrative clerk in Manila, watching from behind a desk as Japan's empire crumbled in real time. She had seen the confidence of her superiors dissolve into desperate retreat, had watched supply reports grow increasingly grim as American submarines strangled Japan's lifelines. Now she wondered what Japan looked like if anything remained of the world she had left behind. If her family in Osaka still lived, or if American firebombing had already reduced her childhood home to ash. In the darkness, someone cried quietly, trying to muffle the sound in their pillow. No one offered comfort. They were strangers bound together only by their capture and their shared uncertainty about what tomorrow would bring. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by nightmares and the unfamiliar sounds of an American military base at night. The first week passed in a blur of rigid routine and careful silence. The Japanese women followed orders with mechanical precision, their faces betraying nothing as they learned the rhythms of camp life. They ate their meals quickly and quietly, always aware of American soldiers watching them not with hostility, but with curiosity that felt almost more unsettling. But the food. The food was more than they had seen in months. White bread, canned vegetables, powdered eggs, meat that came in portions that seemed almost wasteful. Each meal felt like an indictment of everything they had been told about American scarcity and weakness. By late 1944, American industry was producing aircraft, tanks, ships, and rations on a scale Japan couldn't imagine. 296,000 U.S. planes to Japan's 28,000. Even Axis POWs in America received 4,000 calories a day. It's the same as U.S. soldiers. Meanwhile, in Japan, civilians survived on fewer than 1,800 calories. Vegetables vanished, protein became rare, and isolated garrisons lived on roots, insects, and sometimes they're dead. Hunger killed more Japanese troops than American fire. Yuki felt that contrast daily. Before capture, a handful of rice had to last her a day. Now she saw Americans scraping leftovers into bins. How could Japan hope to win against a country that wasted more food than her nation could supply? Sergeant William Billy Harper, a lanky Georgian with an easy smile, often passed the women tending camp gardens. His grandmother in Savannah sent him care packages, cookies, preserves, and sometimes her prized fried chicken. On November 19, 1944, one such package arrived. Billy opened it on the guard station steps, though chicken's aroma peppery, rich, impossibly indulgent trolled across the compound. Yuki froze, mid-task, Kiko, too. 23 Japanese women slowly turned toward Billy, watching in stunned hunger as he took his first bite, tasting a world they'd never imagined. Billy noticed them watching and felt suddenly self-conscious. These women had been half-starved before their capture, surviving on rations that wouldn't sustain a child. Now they were staring at his lunch with expressions that transcended language and nationality pure. Undeniable longing mixed with confusion and something that looked almost like grief. For a long moment, nobody moved. The desert wind stirred dust between the barracks. Somewhere in the distance, another transport truck rumbled down the approach road. Then Billy Harper did something that would echo through the rest of their lives. He stood up, walked toward the garden fence, and held out a piece of chicken toward the nearest prisoner, offering it through the wire mesh with an expression of simple, uncomplicated kindness. Haruka Nakamura stood closest to the fence. At 22, she had been a radio technician in the Philippines, proud of her technical skills and her service to the emperor. Now she stared at the piece of golden brown chicken the American soldier held toward her through the wire. Her mind struggled to process what was happening. This had to be a trick, a test of their discipline. Perhaps he wanted to see if they would break down and beg for food like animals, compromising their dignity for momentary pleasure. But the smell was overwhelming, impossible to ignore. Her mouth watered traitorously, and she hated herself for the weakness, even as her hand moved involuntarily toward the fence. Every instinct screamed danger. Every lesson from her training warned against accepting anything from the enemy. Yet something deeper, more fundamental than ideology or propaganda, responded to the simple human gesture of offered food. "Take it," Billy said softly, gesturing with the chicken. His voice was gentle, without mockery or cruelty. George Takahashi had wandered over, curious about the commotion developing in the garden. He translated quickly, his voice neutral. "The sergeant is offering you food. It's okay to accept." Haruka looked back at Yuki and the other women, seeking guidance. They stood frozen throughout the garden, tools hanging loose in their hands, watching this moment unfold with the weight of something significant they couldn't quite name. Yuki felt Corporal Martinez's presence before she saw her. The female guard had emerged from the barracks, arms crossed, observing the scene with an expression of quiet interest. But she made no move to intervene. If anything, she seemed curious about what would happen next, about whether human connection could bridge the gap propaganda had created. Yuki made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She nodded once to Haruka, a small gesture of permission that carried the weight of surrender not to America, but to basic human need. Haruka's hand trembled as she reached through the fence and accepted the chicken. It was still warm, the coating crispy under her fingers, the weight of it substantial and real. She brought it to her mouth and took a small, hesitant bite. The taste exploded across her tongue like nothing she had ever experienced. The crispy exterior gave way to tender, juicy meat seasoned with pepper and salt and herbs she couldn't begin to identify. It was salty and savory, and rich in a way that seemed almost indecent after months of bland rice and thin soup that barely qualified as food. Her eyes widened in shock. Despite every effort to maintain her composure, despite years of military discipline, a small sound of surprise and pleasure escaped her throat, something between a gasp and a moan. Involuntary and utterly genuine. Billy grinned and turned back to his package, pulling out more pieces. He handed them to George, who carried them to the fence where other women had begun to cautiously approach, drawn by the smell and by Haruka's reaction. One by one, they accepted the offering. Social barriers erected by propaganda crumbled in the face of fried chicken and simple human kindness. Kiko bit into hers, and tears sprang to her eyes. Whether from the overwhelming flavor or the unexpected kindness, even she couldn't say perhaps both. Perhaps the realization that everything they had been taught was wrong, that the enemy was capable of generosity, that the world was more complicated than the simple narratives of good and evil their training had provided. Michiko chewed slowly, her expression transforming from suspicion to wonder. They had been taught that Americans were wasteful and cruel, that their abundance came from exploitation and their power from brutality. But this simple act of sharing food contradicted everything they had been told. This wasn't cruelty. This was generosity from an enemy who didn't seem to understand he was supposed to hate them, who saw hungry women and responded with basic human decency rather than ideological rigidity. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the Texas desert, 23 Japanese women stood in a prison camp garden eating fried chicken and beginning to question every truth they had ever been taught about America, about the war, about the nature of their enemy and the righteousness of their cause. The fried chicken incident became a turning point that neither guards nor prisoners fully understood at first. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the camp shifted in small, almost imperceptible ways. The Japanese women still maintained their disciplined silence during formations, but their eyes no longer held quite the same rigid fear. They began to watch their captors, not as potential torturers, but as individuals, some kind, some indifferent, all surprisingly human. Billy Harper's grandmother continued sending care packages, and Billy continued sharing them. He began learning Japanese phrases from George Takahashi, practicing them awkwardly during his patrols until he could say simple greetings. Ohayo gozaimasu. He would attempt each morning, butchering the syllables so badly that even Yuki was tried hardest to maintain her emotional distance. Sometimes couldn't help the small smile that escaped before she could stop it. Corporal Martinez noticed the gradual thawing and decided to encourage it. She had grown up in a Mexican-American family where food was the language of love and connection, where recipes carried memories and meals brought enemies to the same table. She recognized the power of sharing food to break down barriers that words and ideology had erected. She began assigning some of the Japanese women to kitchen duties, working alongside American staff to prepare meals for the entire camp. German prisoners, Italian prisoners, Japanese prisoners, and American guards, all eating food prepared by the same hands. Kiko, with her background as a nurse and her methodical attention to detail, found herself drawn to the precision of food preparation. She watched carefully as Corporal Martinez demonstrated how to season ground beef for hamburgers, how to bread and fry chicken the way Billy's grandmother had taught her over letters and phone calls. The measurements seemed extravagant, wasteful even. So much meat for one meal, so much flour and oil used without thought to scarcity or rationing. It reinforced everything they had observed about American abundance, the casual wealth of a nation that could afford to feed even its prisoners more than adequately. Language barriers eased as shared kitchen work created common ground. The women learned English words through repetition. The Americans picked up oishi and arigato. By December, the mess hall felt less divided, with soldiers stopping by to exchange awkward but genuine attempts at conversation. December 7, 1944, the Pearl Harbor anniversary changed everything. Captain Whitmore feared anger, but what came was something heavier. George Takahashi brought newspapers filled with images of the burning harbor, the USS Arizona's dead, and detailed accounts of Japanese atrocities in the Philippines and China. The proof was undeniable. Yuki read in the small library, shaken by faces of drowned sailors and the brutal reports from Manila. Kiko joined her, then others, until the room filled with silent tears. Their pride collapsed into shame as they confronted what had been done in their names. In the weeks that followed, the women drifted through a moral fog. Talking quietly with Takahashi, who explained American views while acknowledging his own conflicted heritage, redemption began in the camp kitchen as Corporal Martinez expanded their duties. Food became a shared language. Yuki learned cornbread, Kiko stew, Haruka cookies. Each recipe exchanged softened the boundaries propaganda had built, meal by meal. On September 2, 1945, Japan surrendered aboard the USS Missouri in Fort Stockton, Texas. The Japanese women heard the news with mixed relief, grief, and uncertainty. Captain Whitmore soon announced their repatriation to a homeland devastated by firebombing, atomic ruins, and loss. Most accepted the decision quietly. Japan was still home. But 8 women felt differently. When Yuki Tanaka requested permission to remain in America as a displaced person, others rose beside her. Whitmore understood. In captivity, they had found dignity without brutality and a society that valued individuals beyond ideology. After months of review, the War Department allowed them to stay. They had committed no crimes and symbolized the possibility of reconciliation. Years later, Yuki Tanaka Harper now married to Billy Ron, a small fusion restaurant in San Francisco's Japantown. Her signature dish, Southern fried chicken with rice and miso soup, honored the moment that had changed her life. The day an American soldier offered food through a fence, shattering years of propaganda. Her restaurant became a gathering place for Japanese Americans and veterans, a space where former enemies shared meals. A faded photo on the wall, women and soldiers smiling in a Texas garden, proved how a simple act of kindness could transform prisoners into friends and strangers into family.